I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Research and Studies at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Marti Fullerton, well-known and widely respected former Labor Commissioner of Georgia and a longtime friend and assistant to former Governor Zell Miller. Welcome, Marti.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I'm really looking forward to our conversation and having you share with us some of your memories of your many years in Georgia politics. Before we do that, though, let's talk about your early life in Hayesville, North Carolina.
Okay. Well, for those people who will hopefully be watching this, Hayesville is part of the tri-state area that consists of western North Carolina, northeast Georgia, eastern Tennessee, up in the mountains. And it's just across the line from Young Harris, about 9 miles. And as I was growing up there, in those mountains, contrary to a lot of places or most other places in Georgia, where there for many years was just the Democratic Party, there's always been a two-party system up there. And I was raised a strong yellow dog Democrat. My mother made sure that the first words that came out of my mouth were not Mama or Daddy, but Harry Truman, who I had a chance to meet when I was growing up after he had left the presidency, and I was participating in 4-H club and stuff like that, and had gone to Raleigh for a competition. Now this is really going back a ways, Bob. Luther Hodges, former governor of North Carolina, had former President Truman as a guest that week, and he brought him to some of the 4-H competition that was held at NC State University, and I got to meet him, and it was like, you know, holding hands with God for somebody who was raised the way I was. So when I got out of high school and started at Young Harris College, I guess it was a natural progression to kind of hook up with the Millers. I was on a work scholarship. He was in the state senate at the time, and he hired me to do state senate work, and thank God paid me for it, or I would not have been able to continue to go to school. So, you know, that's how I sort of eased into my involvement in Georgia politics. Mm-hmm. In 1962, when I was at Young Harris, that was the first statewide election, I believe, that was held after the courts did away with the county unit system. Mm-hmm. And Marvin Griffin, who had been governor before, was running against Carl Sanders. And the Millers said to me, you know, we're for Carl Sanders because I believe he served in the Senate with him. Mm-hmm. And but as a part of Georgia history, you need to go with us tonight over to Blairsville. Governor Griffin is going to be over there and is going to be making a stump speech from the back of a pickup truck. Mm-hmm. And it probably will be one of the few opportunities you'll ever have to hear an honest-to-God Southern politician stump speech before those kind of things go the way of the dodo bird and the media takes over. And he was right, it was, and it was enthralling. We got over there and parked. It was on the town square in Blairsville. Waited about an hour for him. He finally showed up. It was obvious that he had been imbibing a little bit, and but he stood up on the back of that pickup truck, and it was like somebody flipped a switch. When that switch was flipped, he just let it roll. And it was, you know, I didn't agree with much of what he said, but it was mesmerizing. Mm-hmm.
You studied under Professor Miller.
I did.
At Young Harris. What sort of a teacher was he?
He was a great teacher. I told this story recently at a luncheon for him for President Kathy Cox to hear. Used to, when, I don't know how they register now, but back in the dark ages when I went to Young Harris, they lined up all the teachers and the tables with them in the student center. And the only reason I got in his classes, and I took every one of them, is because I was a work student and we got to register first because we had, work schedule to worry about too. And it was sort of embarrassing after the work students got through registering. They threw open the doors and everybody ran in to register, and everybody is lined up in front of his desk. If that gives you a clue what kind of teacher he was. And he was excellent. He would come in. Well, first of all, he told you when you registered, don't buy the textbook. That's okay. Can't imagine why not. But anyway, we didn't buy the textbook. He would walk in the classroom and have a little scrap piece of paper in his hand that had 10 terms that he had jotted down. He turned around and wrote them on the blackboard. He never turned around and referred to them again the whole rest of the hour. And that's what he lectured from, and you took notes. So if you took good notes and studied your notes, you could pass tests. But he was so interesting, he made you want to learn all that stuff, and it was not coming out of a dry textbook.
Was there ever a time during those years that you thought he might one day be governor of Georgia or a United States senator?
At the time, I guess I thought he would be United States senator more than I thought he'd be governor, which brings me to 1964. I had already gotten out of Young Harris in 63. Had gone down to Atlanta to work in for the Bowdoin Commission, which was Carl Sanders' reorganization of government commission, like most governors have had them. And then Miller decided he wanted to run for Congress in the 9th Congressional District. No money, practically no contacts, running against one of the most powerful members in Congress by the name of Phil Landrum. I don't think we knew how powerful he was until President Lyndon Johnson came down to Gainesville and personally endorsed him. And I think then we might have had a clue. But it was an interesting race in that he used a lot of Young Harris alumni and their parents and relatives and friends and so forth. There were 22 counties in that district. We traveled all over. We had a little headquarters in Gainesville downtown that somebody had donated, and Hank Huckabee, who is currently Chancellor of the University System in Georgia, and I were his only staff. We were not paid. Therefore, we lived with the Millers in Young Harris, and Shirley gave us a place to sleep and fed us in lieu of a salary because we were not raising any money. We didn't know how. Like I said, we didn't have a clue. One of the bright ideas that Miller had was to take this great big huge old Plymouth station wagon and build this gigantic wooden, he had one of his buddies at Young Harris do this, build a great big huge wooden fish and anchor it on top of that station wagon. Well, what this was supposed to represent is that Phil Landrum, instead of voting for things that people needed in the 9th Congressional District of Georgia, voted to put this big aquarium in Washington and voted, you know, X number of $1 million to put all these fish in there. Mm-hmm. And that's the point we were trying to make. And we rode that thing all over all the 22 counties in the 9th District. Hank and I did. And this guy who came out of Homer, Georgia, by the name of Phil Gailey, who went on to become a distinguished journalist. The three of us rode around all over those rural counties and had the microphone on talking about it. Well, you know, a few people heard it, but mainly it was the cows out in the fields and all that stuff. But it was fun. We, like I said, we didn't have a clue what we were doing, and he almost won. Mm-hmm. Almost.
That was the year of Franklin Stone Buckeye U, was it not?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, those boats didn't count.
Yep.
I often wondered why, because it was so close and because there were so many ballots thrown out, that he never asked for a recount. Do you know why not?
I do not know why not.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to President Johnson, do you think that his endorsement of Miller's opponent helped or hurt?
I think, looking back on it, I think at the time we were all awed by the fact that a president of the United States would do this. But I think that in that particular independent mountain district, it probably had the effect of a lot of the natives saying, hey, you know, I don't care if he is president, he's not going to come down here and tell me who to vote for.
Right. That was during his Appalachian Program, though.
That's correct.
And that program helped that region a good bit.
It did help it a good bit.
Okay, well, Miller lost that race very close, decided to come back in 1966.
That's right.
Did you participate in that one?
I participated a little bit, but I was getting ready to, I had married by that time, and we were getting ready to move down to Tallahassee and go to Florida State. So I sort of missed that one. Mm-hmm.
But after Florida, you came back to Georgia.
I did.
As I recall, to help rewrite the Constitution.
That was the job I got when I came back from Tallahassee. There was a commission established by what, I guess Maddox was governor then. That was in '69. Mm-hmm. Yeah. To rewrite the state constitution. Mm-hmm. And I went on, I believe it was the Revenue Department's payroll. Mm-hmm. The way, you know, we're working that was loaning people from different state agencies to help with all of it. So
that Constitution was never approved, was it?
You know, Bob, I think parts of it were, but I don't think the whole thing ever was.
Yeah, it passed the House, as I recall, but the Senate refused to do it. Yeah, a lot of work lost. Robin Harris.
Robin Harris headed it up. Yeah. He was in the House then from DeKalb County.
Right. So what happened after that, Marty?
Well, what happened after that is I went to work for George T. Smith, who was lieutenant governor. And then I went to his re-election campaign, and that was, you know, before governors could succeed themselves. So Maddox couldn't run for governor again, so he dropped down and ran for lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. And of course won the race. And after I got booted out of the office, I believe Governor Maddox had told Miller, you know, I'm leaving it up to you. She's your friend. Get rid of her.
Really?
Yeah. So
interesting to know that Miller worked with Maddox when he was governor, and also for a while as lieutenant governor.
He did indeed, and I think that the fact that Tommy Irvin and Zell Miller were his two top guys. Mm-hmm. Probably went a long way toward making Lester Maddox look as good as he did.
Yeah. Well, at some point you joined Miller when he headed the Georgia Democratic Party.
I did. And that was about, those days were about like they are now. It was tough to be a Democrat. That was in 1972 when George McGovern was the nominee. Mm-hmm. And we went to Miami to the National Convention. Mm-hmm. And they put the Georgia delegation off in some third-rate hotel. And, you know, not thinking anyway that George McGovern was going to do well, which of course he didn't. But that was, like I said, it was tough to be a Democrat in those years.
Well, the Democrats had ruled the roost, though, for many, many years.
Yeah.
Very few Republicans in elective office. Let's talk for a minute about party politics in Georgia.
Okay.
It's obvious we've undergone a complete turnaround in party power from Democrat to Republican. What caused that, do you think?
Well, to go back to Lyndon Johnson again, I think he was absolutely dead right. Whenever he got the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964, was it, and signed it into law, he said, or he's famously quoted as saying, "This will be the demise of the Democratic Party in the South for at least the next 50 years. And I think he was exactly right about that.
Someone said to understand Southern politics, you've got to understand race. That's been true through the years, hasn't it?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
Yes. Although the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act has activated a lot of minority voters.
It did, and it was obviously a good thing.
Well, let's go back to your career. 1974, pivotal point in Georgia politics. The governor's race, the lieutenant governor's race. George Busbee, as I recall, was elected governor. And
That's
I think
right.
you were involved in that campaign.
I was.
And what was your role?
Well, let's back up here a couple of years. After the Democratic Convention in '72, of course, contributions to the state party dropped off to almost nothing, so he had to get rid of staff. Mm-hmm. And I went to work at WSB-TV, and that's where I was working when George Busbee, Miller was running for lieutenant governor, and there were a bunch of people in that race, as I recall, like there was in the governor's race. Maddox was back in it. George T. Smith was in it. George Busbee was in it. I can't remember who else.
Bobby Rowan.
Bobby Rowan in the Democratic Party. That's right. I had forgotten Bobby was in that.
Burt Lance.
Burt Lance, yes, absolutely. Anyway, you're right. That was a big year in Georgia politics. But anyway, George Busbee called me up and asked me would I work for him, and I told him I couldn't, full time. But if he got in the runoff, and everybody sort of assumed it was going to be him and Maddox, which of course it turned out to be. And I asked him if he would ask the powers that be at Cox Broadcasting to give me 3 weeks leave to work in the runoff. I would do that. So he did, and I did. And mainly what I was doing those 3 weeks was raising money. Mm-hmm. He locked me in a room with about 5 guys that, who were big stuff in Georgia, could raise a lot of money, and said, don't come out until you raise X number of dollars. So that's basically what we did for 3 weeks, was raise money.
That's the toughest job in politics.
It is indeed.
Well, come January 1975, both Busbee and Miller win.
Correct.
They were inaugurated, as I recall, in January of that year. And I believe you joined the Miller staff shortly thereafter.
I did.
Tell us about working with Zell Miller.
He is, he's one of the smartest people I've ever been around. He uses his God-given talent and brain, I think, for the good of this state. and has for many years. Sometimes he's hard to work for because he has a volatile temper. You know that. And some of us could tie up for some pretty good fights.
Mm-hmm. If you had to describe him in one word,
oh Lord,
what would you say?
I would say one word: goodness, integrity.
Right.
I think that's probably as close as, there's a lot of other words I want to use, but
yeah.
You're limiting me to one word, that it's going to be integrity.
There's no doubt that he was a consummate politician. Mm-hmm. I can't think of anyone in my experience who has been able to overcome more setbacks than he has done and remain as politically strong as he has been. How? Why?
I think the work ethic is one thing. He can outwork anybody. There again, the integrity, the brain power, the popularity. I remember in 1980 when he ran for the U.S. Senate against Herman Talmadge. And I guess everybody kind of knew he was going to lose that race, and everybody wrote his political obituary. Mm-hmm. But you're right, he always came back. He would claw his way back, and each time he did it, I think he got stronger.
Mm-hmm. He thrived on action.
He thrived on action. He used to thrive on controversy.
Yeah.
Creating it or jumping into something that's already going on. Mm-hmm. And a while ago you said he was a consummate politician. I can remember several times when he was lieutenant governor when there would be important legislation and that might have passed or failed by one or two votes. One of them in particular I want to just mention was the branch banking bill. Georgia was lagging behind North Carolina, particularly on that. So North Carolina became the banking center of the South. Georgia could have, but anyway, they finally got enough votes. Some people didn't think so, but they finally got enough votes to beat the independent bankers and let the big boys branch. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of the senators who was leading the opposition, who shall remain nameless, called me out of the lieutenant governor's office the day before the vote in the Senate on the branch banking bill and said, "Your boss is going to get his butt beat tomorrow." Said, "I've counted the votes. We're going to win by one vote." And I looked at him and I said, "You've served in this Senate a while. One thing you ought to know is that Zell Miller can count, and he can count votes. We're going to win by 2. We won by 2. Mm-hmm. He had it figured exactly right. Mm-hmm. He knew who was going to weasel, who was going to stick, Yeah. He's always had an uncanny ability to do that. Sometimes to his detriment, because before he ran for governor, as you know, he not only wanted to be the candidate, but the campaign manager, the top fundraiser, run the whole show. Mm-hmm. So when he ran for governor, it was a new day, and I think a couple of things happened that had not happened in Georgia before. One was that he, I think, was the first candidate to full-time hire an outside political consultant, an outside media firm, mm-hmm. and an outside professional pollster. Mm-hmm. And that was an eye-opener and an education. But the day had come in Georgia when, you know, you don't give stump speeches anymore. It's not personal anymore. It's media. Mm-hmm. And right. I think that was the kind of the benchmark race mm-hmm. on that. And it was the first time that in a statewide race, a good amount of money was raised before the race officially started, mm-hmm. Which would have been, you know, in the spring of 1990, but we had been working on it for a year and a half before that. Mm-hmm. I left the lieutenant governor's office, went on leave without pay, moved over to Virgil Williams' office over in Stone Mountain. Virgil is one of the high muckety-muck influential business people in the state of Georgia who had committed to Miller early on and said, you know, you're going to need X number of $1 million and I'm the person to help you raise it. So he put me to work in Virgil's office. I was like 2 doors down from Virgil. By this time, Tom Moreland had left the state and was working for Virgil. And we all worked together day and night, and in less than 9 months doing little fundraisers all over the state. One thing Miller had said, I want to devote the whole year of 1990 to fundraising where the big dollars are. So let's do the little stuff first. Well, as I was driving up here today, I'm going through towns that I haven't been through since we did those little fundraisers. Mm-hmm. Thompson, Georgia, you know, Louisville, mm-hmm. Swainsboro. And we had fish fries, we had barbecues, but in less than 9 months, we raised over $1 million. Mm. We had some big ticket fundraisers around the Atlanta area and Savannah and, you know, mm-hmm. Macon and some of the second-tier cities. But a lot of that came from little rural areas who early on got to touch the candidate mm-hmm. in person. Mm-hmm. And they remembered that going into the governor's race.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to the lieutenant governorship.
Okay.
16 years is a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to keep an organization together for that long. What do you think was the key to Miller's success in having very little opposition during that period?
I think he kept his fences mended, his contacts up to date in between races. We did, you know, personal stuff for people all over the state. And, you know, we mentioned this earlier, but I guess you would have to agree with this. The genesis of his support from day one was Young Harris, mm-hmm. alumni. Mm-hmm. And those folks stuck with him through everything.
Mm-hmm. Tom Murphy.
Okay.
You knew him well.
Great American and a great Georgian.
And the disputes he had with Miller for those 16 years.
First and foremost, I think that was way overblown by the media. Secondly, I think that Murphy and Miller are a great deal alike. Stubborn, Irish, loyal to their friends, stick to their positions, and I guess this is where all this overblown media came in. Sometimes Miller's here and Murphy's here, but both of them were good enough, excellent politicians that they could always get together for the good of the state. I don't think, for instance, there wouldn't be a World Congress Center if it were not for Miller and Murphy getting together on things like that.
Mm-hmm. Some people have said that they thought that relationship was healthy because it made people pay more attention to the big issues.
That could be.
Okay, so now it's Miller's turn to run for governor. He's waited patiently for 16 years. He served faithfully with George Busbee and then with Joe Frank Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And then came that period that you just described of running for governor. He brought in James Carville. Tell us about James Carville.
James Carville, you talk about a great American and a great Cajun. James was one of those people when he and Paul Begala were in business together at that time, and were diametrically opposite personalities in the whole 9 yards. What they had in common was the fact that ideas just poured out of their head. You could almost sit there and watch James on the phone just coming out like this.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was exactly what the consultant that the Miller campaign needed, because he would not let Miller run his campaign.
Mm-hmm.
He said, that's what you're paying me the big dollars for.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're helping to raise money for, is to pay my salary,
mm-hmm.
my fees.
Mm-hmm.
You are the candidate.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not the way that he was accustomed to running his races.
That's right.
He was always his own campaign manager. Well, the big issue in that campaign was the state lottery.
It was.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
It was very controversial in the beginning. And how did you go about using that issue?
I think it hinged on two things. Number one, the money. Number two, how to treat the money you get from this. Don't make the same mistake that other states have made and put it in a general fund. You've got to have a purpose for it. Therefore, he came up with, the HOPE and pre-K and all that, which was a brilliant move because people bought into it and really believed in it.
And it's been successful.
I think it's been very successful. I don't know about lately. I haven't kept up except, just reading in the press what.
Give something to get something.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was his motto. Let's talk about his first year or two in office.
Okay.
He was very active and very eager and always looking for a better way.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the programs you remember?
Oh, gosh. Some would say restless, I guess. I don't know, Bob. I'm going to have to think about that one for a while. There's so many, I don't know how to.
Okay, let's talk about his relationship with Bill Clinton.
Okay.
He's given credit for really putting Clinton over the top because he
mm-hmm.
was able to persuade his fellow governors to have the big primaries on the same day. What do you know about their relationship?
There again, I think they're a lot alike. When Miller was thinking of running for governor and looking at political consultants, Clinton is the one who recommended Carville because he had done at least a couple for him in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. I think that both of them, at the time they were both in office, Clinton as president and Miller as governor, lived, breathed, ate, and slept politics. I think they both loved it. I think they're both students of political history. Sometimes they've been on opposite sides, but I don't know that it's hurt their friendship any.
Mm-hmm. One of the one of the planks in Miller's platform was to serve only one term. He changed his mind.
Some of us The genesis of that, I'm going to tell this story for the first time. We were over on this campus going to the every 2-year thing, you know, at the Institute of Government when the new legislators come in and they have the seminars for them and all this. And there were still a couple of people in the governor's race that he was worried about and kind of wanted to get out, and he thought if he said, I'll only serve 1 term and I challenged my opponents to do the same, that would be great. Well, several of us begged him not to do it. But there again, once he made up his mind to do something, he did it. Mm-hmm. And of course it didn't work, you know.
Right. Why do you think he changed his mind? Was it because he wanted to see some more programs through, or was he just joking the first time?
I think he wanted to see some more programs through, and I don't think he was joking. I think he really thought that would be a pretty good political strategy to get some of those other folks out of the governor's race.
You remember that promise he made and to give up power as lieutenant governor to appoint committees?
And that didn't work either. I remember that.
Yes, it didn't work. Giving up power is hard for a politician to do.
Thank goodness there were some members of the Senate at that time who shared that power, that, you know, when he went back to him and said, hey, I was wrong, they gave his power back to him.
Right, yeah. So that 1990 successful election, 1994 was a new election. Were you involved in that one?
I was not involved in that one.
What were you doing at that time?
I was deputy commissioner in the state labor department.
Right. Good. You were there for how long?
I was there for 6 years, and then after Miller got elected second term, I worked for David Porthris for, I don't know, a year or two. Then I went back over to the governor's office for a year, and then David decided he was going to run for governor, so he resigned as labor commissioner. Mm-hmm. And Miller appointed me to fill the unexpired term.
Did you enjoy that?
I did. I enjoyed it for, number one, I already knew how the department worked, so I didn't have to go through a learning curve. And, you know, I knew what I thought needed to be done.
Tell us a little bit about that department.
Well, most people know it as the department, you know, that sends out unemployment checks. And that's a function of it, certainly. The employment side of it goes hand in hand with it. They also work with private employers to help get jobs, and usually the federal job training money is passed through that department. So all of the job training stuff that goes on in the state goes through the labor department. And in Georgia, the function of inspecting elevators and escalators and boilers and all kinds of that, you know, safety engineering is what it's called, came out of that department also.
Some people think that the labor commissioner should be appointed and not elected. What do you think?
My personal opinion, I think it should be appointed.
Shouldn't be put to the voters.
I think it's a mostly specialized, as I've just said, you know, there are specific duties that...
You decided not to run for election. Why?
Well, we decided. By we, I mean Miller and I decided. I was getting pretty close to retirement, and he was going out as governor the next year, what we all thought would be his swan song. It turned out not to be, thank goodness. But anyway, he said, you know, go over there and do what you need to do. But since there were about 3 people in that race that were, you know, friends of his already. And he said, "You probably don't need to run." And I said, "Well, when you swear me in, I'll make that announcement." So I did. And then I got over there, and the first thing I did was, had to do it, get embroiled in a controversy with Mayor Bill Campbell over federal job training money and the misappropriation thereof. And that dragged on for months and months, and even got the president's office somewhat involved in it, because Campbell thought, you know, I'm close to Bill Clinton, I'll get them to intervene and we can cut this off at the pass. And it turned out not to be that way, because when I found out he was going to him, I went to the governor, and, you know, we got that nipped in the bud. So,
do you regret not running?
Sort of. Yes and no.
Well, you certainly would have won.
I don't know. I think there were some strong candidates in there.
But you had the Miller support.
I did.
And you remember when he went out of office, he had the highest rating of any governor in history.
He did indeed.
Like 85%, if I'm correct in that.
He did indeed.
Okay, so what happened after that, Marty?
After Labor Commissioner, Michael Thurmond won, of course, and I stayed with him about 6 months to do the transition stuff and what have you, and then retired.
How many years?
Off and on, about 40.
40 years. Have you really retired from politics, or do you still participate?
I guess a better word than participate is I dabble in it. There have been a couple of local races since I moved to Savannah that I have participated in, one of which I'm participating in right now.
Miller was your mentor?
Absolutely. No question.
How often do you see your old friends? You know, one thing that I wanted to mention was that the media back in the campaign for Congress referred to you guys as the kids. How often do you see the kids?
Not often enough. I guess that's everybody's problem. We get involved in our own little lives and don't see folks we need to and care about often enough.
Well, as you look back, Marty, on your career, is there anything you would have done differently?
I might have tried to talk Miller into letting me run for Labor Commissioner. I don't know. But that's water under the bridge. Other than that, there's not anything I think I would have done differently. You know, working for him, I got to meet people, go places, and do things that a little old girl that just fell off the turnip truck from Hayesville, North Carolina, would not have gotten to do.
What do you feel was your greatest accomplishment?
I guess when I was Labor Commissioner, making the people who worked in the Labor Department feel like they were worthwhile people again. After, as you know, that was one of the departments that went through a lot of turmoil with some of the commissioners. So they were really beaten down and morale was low, and, you know, I think I helped that. I tried to anyway.
Your biggest disappointment?
Ooh. I can't think of a big disappointment, Bob. I really can't.
Well, that's good. What advice would you give to women candidates who run for office today?
Women candidates or all candidates?
Well, either, both.
I think you need to be thoroughly educated on the issues of your particular race. I think you need to work extremely hard. I think you need to try to put coalitions and our groups together. I would like to see, I realize that this is probably a pipe dream, but I would like to see more personal one-on-one campaigning than just strictly using media all the time.
Mm-hmm. The media has taken the fun out of politics.
It has.
You no longer see the Marvin Griffins and the Gene Talmadges of the world.
That's right.
And that's a shame, really.
It is.
It's a shame because not only does it rob us of that great time, us older people, but the young folks just don't realize what politics used to be.
No, they don't. And
Marty.
they don't. You know, Miller would do things like if somebody did him a favor or sent him a contribution, you had to write a thank you letter. You had to make sure that person got a thank you note. Sometimes he hand wrote his own. People don't do that anymore either. I think courtesy is, and I partially blame that on the internet. Mm-hmm. You know, it's all email. It's no letters or notes anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about a lot of things. You have great memories, I'm sure. What have we missed?
Well, let me leave you with this story. When Miller was the 16 years he was lieutenant governor, he participated in all of the National Lieutenant Governors Conference stuff and was very popular and highly respected by the other lieutenant governors. One time we were going to a convention, I don't know where, I've forgotten where, but anyway, I went like a day early, and he and Shirley were coming the next day. And he said to me, I want you to go to the opening reception. And if the current chairman of the conference and the incoming chairman want to know if I want anything, I want to be chairman of the Southern region, unless Jimmy Green from North Carolina wants it, and then I'll step aside. I said, okay. So I get to wherever this was, and I go to the opening reception, and Bill Scranton from Pennsylvania was the, I guess, current chairman. And Martha Lane Collins from Kentucky was the incoming. And I walked up to him and told him, you know, what Miller had said, and they both looked at me and went, we don't want him to be chairman of the Southern region. I said, really? You know, having no idea what was coming, and they said, no, we want him to be chairman of the whole conference. I said, okay, we can handle that. So the next day when the Millers got there, he says to me, come here, come here. I said, you can't be chairman of the Southern region. He said, well, phooey, I thought Jimmy Green wouldn't want it anymore. And I said, well, he does. I said, but how about being chairman of the whole conference? And he stopped and he went, okay, I think I can do that.
Marty, it's been fun.
Thank you. It's been great fun.
One last question.
Okay.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as somebody who cared about the people I came in contact with.
Good. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Bob. It's been my pleasure.